I was standing at my kitchen counter, slicing tomatoes for the salad I'd planned for dinner, when Richard walked in with that leather folder he always carried to his consulting meetings. The afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows of my craftsman home in Portland, the house I'd bought 23 years ago with my first big bonus as a corporate attorney, and for just a moment, everything felt normal. My son was visiting on a Thursday afternoon, probably stopping by on his way home from work. Maybe he'd stay for dinner. Maybe we'd actually have a pleasant conversation for once. Then he opened that folder, and I knew immediately that whatever was coming would be anything but pleasant. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your finances." He spread several documents across my granite countertop, right next to my cutting board, and I noticed his hands weren't shaking at all. There was a confidence in his movements that made my stomach tighten. Richard had always been anxious as a child, fidgety and uncertain, but the man standing in my kitchen at 32 years old had none of that nervous energy. He looked like someone who'd already made a decision and was simply informing me of the outcome. I set down my knife carefully. "What kind of conversation?" "I've been going over your situation, and Melissa and I think it's time we took a more active role in managing your affairs." He pulled out what looked like bank statements, my bank statements, and I felt a cold shock run through me. How did he have those? "Your spending has been erratic. You're forgetting to pay bills on time. Last month, your electric company sent a disconnect notice." That was a lie. I'd never missed a utility payment in my entire adult life. I opened my mouth to say so, but Richard kept talking. "We've already contacted First National, and they've agreed to help us set up an automatic transfer system." He slid a form across the counter toward me, and I saw my own bank's letterhead at the top. "Starting next month, your pension and Social Security, that's $4,200 total, will be deposited directly into an account that Melissa and I will manage for you. We'll handle all your expenses, make sure your bills get paid, give you an allowance for groceries and personal items. It's really the most responsible thing to do at this stage." My mouth had gone completely dry. I picked up the document, and the words seemed to swim in front of my eyes. Account holder transfer authorization, beneficiary designation change, my signature line at the bottom waiting for me to sign away my financial independence. At this stage, I finally managed to say, "Richard, what are you talking about? I'm 58 years old. I'm in perfect health. I haven't forgotten a single bill." He gave me that patient smile, the one he'd started using about 6 months ago. The one that made me feel like I was a confused elderly woman instead of someone who'd built a successful career spanning 3 decades. "Mom, I know this is hard to hear, but you're not seeing it clearly. That's part of the problem. Melissa and I have been documenting the warning signs for months now." "Warning signs of what?" "Cognitive decline." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was diagnosing a leaky faucet. "You repeat stories. You lose track of time. Last month you called me twice in one day asking the same question about whether we were coming for Thanksgiving. You're becoming forgetful, and it's only going to get worse." I stared at my son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when Richard was 7, the young man I'd put through Stanford by taking on extra cases and working 70-hour weeks, and I didn't recognize him. The Richard I knew was sometimes distant, occasionally selfish in that way young adults can be, but he wasn't cruel. He wasn't calculating. Yet here he stood in my kitchen, calmly telling me that I was losing my mind, and I could see in his eyes that he actually expected me to believe it. "I'm not signing anything," I said quietly. His expression hardened just slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this. It would be so much easier if you'd just cooperate." He pulled out another document, and this one made my blood run cold. It was a letter from a Dr. Patterson at Portland Senior Wellness Center, detailing concerns about my apparent memory lapses and confusion during recent interactions with family members. I'd never been to Portland Senior Wellness Center. I'd never heard of Dr. Patterson. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Documentation, Mom. We've been keeping records. Melissa has dated notes about every concerning incident. I've spoken with your neighbors about the times you've seemed disoriented. We have testimony from people who care about you that you're not managing well on your own anymore." That's when he said it. The words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. The words that changed everything between us. "A partir de hoje, mãe, O banco vai transferir toda a sua aposentadoria diretamente para a minha conta, pois logo em breve você morrerá. He said it in Portuguese, my mother's language, the language I'd taught him as a child, so he'd stay connected to his grandmother's heritage. Maybe he thought using Portuguese would soften it somehow, make it less brutal. It didn't. If anything, hearing those words in the language of my mother, who'd immigrated to this country with nothing and built a life through sheer determination, made the betrayal cut even deeper. From today on, Mom, the bank will transfer all your retirement directly to my account, because soon enough you'll die. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. I didn't respond. I couldn't. What do you say when your own son tells you he's already planning for your death? When he's speaking about it not with grief or fear, but with the casual certainty of someone who's been counting on it? Richard must have taken my silence as acceptance, because he started gathering his papers, sliding them back into his folder with efficient movements. I know this feels overwhelming right now, but you'll see. In a few weeks, you'll realize this was the right decision. Melissa and I will take care of everything. You won't have to worry about bills or investments or any of it anymore. You can just relax and enjoy whatever time you have left, whatever time I have left, as if my death was already scheduled, a certainty rather than the inevitable uncertainty we all face. I stood there at my kitchen counter, my hands pressed flat against the cool granite, and watched my son walk toward my front door. He paused in the doorway, turning back with what might have been genuine concern on his face, or maybe just the performance of it. Oh, and Mom? We're going to need you to add Melissa to your will as co-executor, just as a backup, in case something happens to me. We'll have our attorney draw up the paperwork next week. I'll bring it by for you to sign. Then he was gone, and I was alone in my kitchen with half-sliced tomatoes and the wreckage of my relationship with my only child scattered across the counter in the form of forged documents and manufactured diagnoses. I didn't cry. I'd learned a long time ago that tears don't solve problems. Strategy does. I'd spent 40 years in corporate law, handling complex cases involving fraud, breach of contract, and fiduciary responsibility. I knew when I was looking at a calculated plan, and this was exactly that. Richard and Melissa weren't worried about my well-being. They were positioning themselves to take control of my assets, and from the looks of these documents, they'd been planning it for months. The question was why. Richard had a good job, or so I thought. He and Melissa lived in a nice condo in the Pearl District. They drove decent cars, took vacations, seemed financially stable. Why would they need to manufacture a case for my incompetence and steal my retirement income? I looked down at the documents he'd left behind, and my attorney brain started clicking into gear, analyzing what I was seeing. The bank form had a reference number, which meant Richard had actually initiated something with First National. The fake doctor's letter was dated 3 weeks ago, which meant this plan had been in motion for at least that long. The witness statements he'd mentioned from neighbors. Had he actually been talking to people about me? Planting seeds of doubt about my mental state? That night, after I'd abandoned any pretense of making dinner and poured myself a glass of the Pinot Noir I kept for special occasions. Though what was special about discovering your son's betrayal? I couldn't say. I sat at my dining room table and made a list. It's what I'd always done when facing a complex case. Identify what you know, what you don't know, and what you need to find out. What I knew: Richard was trying to gain control of my finances through some combination of legal maneuvering and manufactured evidence of my incompetence. He had access to my bank statements somehow. He'd created or obtained a false medical assessment. He believed I would die soon, or at least he was willing to say so. What I didn't know: why he needed my money so desperately, how far he was willing to go, who else was involved, whether the bank transfer he mentioned was already in process or just a threat. What I needed to find out: everything. I pulled out my laptop and spent the next 3 hours researching. I called my bank's after-hours customer service line and, identifying myself with my account number and security questions, asked whether there had been any recent inquiries or attempted changes to my account. The representative, a tired-sounding woman named Brenda, put me on hold for 7 minutes and then came back with information that made my hands shake. Mrs. Morrison, I'm showing that we received a request 2 weeks ago to add a cosigner to your primary checking and to modify your direct deposit arrangements. However, the signature on the authorization form didn't match our records, so our fraud department flagged it for verification. They attempted to reach you by phone multiple times, but the contact number provided went to voicemail. The request is currently on hold pending your in-person verification. I closed my eyes. So Richard had already tried, had already forged my signature, and the only reason it hadn't worked was because some Alert Bank employee had noticed the forgery. That bought me time, but not much. He'd be back with a better plan, a more convincing approach. Thank you, Brenda. Can you make a note in my file that no changes to my account are to be made under any circumstances without my personal, in-person authorization with photo ID verification? And I'd like to schedule an appointment with your fraud department for tomorrow morning. Of course, ma'am, I'm putting that note in your file right now with highest priority flags. After I hung up, I sat in my dark dining room and thought about the refrigerator. It was an odd thing to think about, I know, but it was relevant. Richard knew that I kept important documents in a sealed plastic container in the vegetable drawer of my refrigerator. It was an old trick I'd learned from my grandmother. People who break into houses look in filing cabinets and safes, but they rarely check the produce drawer. Over the years, I'd kept various things there. My passport when I wasn't traveling, the title to my house, stock certificates, my original birth certificate. Richard had known about this since he was a teenager, after the one time we'd had a small kitchen fire and he'd helped me rescue the important documents. "Why the fridge, Mom?" he'd asked, and I'd explained the logic. He'd laughed and called it genius. Now, sitting in the darkness of my dining room, I decided to make use of that knowledge. If Richard was desperate enough to forge bank documents, he might be desperate enough to break into my house looking for something he could use. Maybe the title to this house, maybe my investment account information, maybe my will. And if he did, I wanted him to find something very specific. I spent the next 2 hours preparing. I drafted a document on my computer, printed it on the heavy bond paper I kept for important correspondence, and placed it in a sealed envelope. Then I gathered several other papers, true documents that would break Richard's assumptions about me into 1,000 pieces. I put them all in the plastic container in my refrigerator, right where Richard would look if he decided to search my house. Then I went upstairs, set my alarm for 6 a.m., and tried to sleep. I couldn't. Not really. I kept replaying Richard's words, his tone, the casual certainty with which he'd discussed my impending death. But I also started planning. Because if there was one thing 40 years of litigation had taught me, it was this: the best defense is a devastating offense, and you have to strike before your opponent knows the battle has begun. I suppose I should explain how I got here, to this moment of my own son plotting to steal my life out from under me. It didn't happen overnight. The signs were there, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious once I knew what I was looking at. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Richard came into this world on a snowy February morning in 1993, 3 weeks early and screaming like he was outraged at the inconvenience of being born. His father, Thomas, was beside himself with joy. We'd tried for 5 years to have a child, had almost given up, and then there was Richard, 7 pounds, 2 ounces of possibility and promise. Thomas died 4 years later in a car accident on Highway 26, black ice and bad timing, and suddenly I was a 31-year-old widow with a child who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I threw myself into work because I had to. Thomas had been a high school teacher, and while we'd been comfortable, we certainly hadn't been wealthy. His life insurance paid off our modest starter home and gave me a small cushion, but raising a child alone in Portland meant I needed to build a career fast. I'd made junior partner at Henderson & Associates the year before Thomas died, and I made full partner 2 years after, taking on the complex corporate litigation cases that nobody else wanted because they paid the best and gave me the credibility I needed. Richard grew up in law firm conference rooms and client dinner parties. He did his homework at my desk while I prepped witnesses. He learned to be quiet and self-sufficient because his mother was often on the phone negotiating settlements worth millions of dollars. I missed soccer games and school plays, and I've carried that guilt every day since. But I also gave him opportunities: private schools, summer camps, SAT tutors, eventually Stanford. I gave him everything I could except the one thing he probably needed most: my time. He was a good kid mostly, quiet, studious, never got into serious trouble. He had friends, but wasn't particularly social. He excelled at math and economics, struggled with creative writing, played mediocre tennis. Normal. When he got into Stanford's business school, I felt like I'd done something right. When he graduated with honors and landed a job at Deloitte's consulting division in Portland, I thought my sacrifices had paid off. My son was launched, successful, independent. Then he met Melissa. She was 22 when they started dating, fresh out of Portland State with a marketing degree and a social media presence she'd cultivated since high school. Richard was 29, and I watched him fall for her with the kind of intensity that worried me even then. She was beautiful in that studied Instagram way. Perfect makeup, perfect outfits, perfect angles for every photo. She called me Mrs. M and complimented my house and asked me questions about my career that seemed genuinely interested, and I wanted to like her because Richard clearly adored her. But there was something calculated in how she looked at my home. I'd catch her studying my grandmother's crystal chandelier in the dining room, or running her fingers along the marble fireplace mantel, or asking pointed questions about when I'd bought the house and what it might be worth now. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for reasons not to like my son's girlfriend because no one would ever be good enough for him. They got engaged after dating for 11 months. The wedding was at a vineyard in Willamette Valley, elegant and expensive. Richard asked me to contribute $20,000, which I did without hesitation, even though I noticed that Melissa's parents, who apparently owned a successful chain of fitness centers, contributed nothing. "They're having cash flow issues with the business," Richard explained, "and I didn't push. It was his wedding. I wanted him to be happy." The trouble started small, about 6 months after they got married. Richard called asking to borrow $5,000 to cover some unexpected expenses. I wired it the same day. 3 months later, he needed another $8,000, then $12,000. Each time, he had a reasonable explanation. Medical bills from a procedure Melissa had needed, car repairs after an accident, a shortfall between selling their old condo and buying a new one. Each time, I gave him the money because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We help our children when they're struggling. Looking back now, I realize I never got any of it back. He always said he'd pay me back once things stabilized, but things apparently never stabilized. The requests just kept coming. About a year ago, the nature of Richard's visits started to change. He'd always been somewhat distant as an adult, busy with work and his marriage, which I understood, but suddenly he was coming by every week, sometimes twice a week. At first, I was pleased. I thought maybe he was finally making time for his mother. Then I started noticing patterns. He'd make comments about my memory. "Mom, you already told me that story," he'd say, even when I was certain I hadn't. Or, "Don't you remember? We talked about this last week, about conversations I was absolutely sure we'd never had." When I'd challenge him, he'd get this concerned look on his face and say something like, "It's okay, Mom. It happens to everyone as they get older." I was 57 years old. I'd just finished a consulting project for my old firm, reviewing a massive contract dispute that required me to remember details from hundreds of documents. My mind was sharp as it had ever been. But Richard's comments planted seeds of doubt. Was I forgetting things? Was I repeating myself? Melissa started coming along on these visits about 8 months ago. She'd walk through my house like she was conducting an inventory, commenting on various items. "This Persian rug must be worth a fortune," or "I've always loved this dining room set," or "Your art collection is remarkable, Mrs. M. Have you had it appraised recently?" She'd pull out her phone and take photos of things, claiming she was just appreciating the beauty, but I'd catch her zooming in on maker's marks and signature details. Then came the suggestions, gentle at first. "You know, Mrs. M, this house is awfully big for one person. Have you thought about downsizing?" Richard and I saw the cutest townhouse near us, just 2 bedrooms, so much more manageable. Or, "You should really have someone helping you with yard work and housekeeping. It's too much for you to handle alone." I had a landscaping service. I had a housekeeper who came twice a month. My house was perfectly maintained. But Melissa would point out a leaf on the walkway or a window that needed washing and suggest I wasn't keeping up with things the way I used to. The real turning point came 4 months ago. Richard showed up unannounced on a Sunday morning and asked if he could use my computer because his laptop had died, and he needed to send an urgent email for work. I let him use my home office, thought nothing of it. He was in there for about 45 minutes. Later that day, I realized he'd left the browser open, and I saw that he hadn't just sent an email. He'd logged into my bank accounts using passwords he must have found saved in my browser settings. I should have confronted him then. I should have changed all my passwords immediately and demanded an explanation. But I talked myself out of it. Maybe he was just checking to see if I was financially stable, making sure his aging mother wasn't being scammed or making poor decisions. Maybe it came from a place of genuine concern. What a fool I was. 2 months after that, I got a call from my health insurance company asking about claims submitted for psychiatric evaluations and memory testing. I hadn't had any such evaluations. When I investigated, I found that someone had used my insurance information to schedule appointments at 3 different senior wellness centers, including the Portland Senior Wellness Center that Dr. Patterson supposedly worked for. Someone was building a medical file suggesting I was experiencing cognitive decline, and that someone had access to my personal information. I started keeping better track after that. I kept a detailed journal, writing down every conversation, every visit, every odd occurrence. I documented Richard's requests for money. It turned out he'd borrowed $42,000 from me over the past 2 years. I started researching signs of financial elder abuse, and the checklist might as well have been written about my own situation. Unexpected visits, uncharacteristic interest in finances, isolation from friends, claims of incompetence, pressure to change legal documents. Through a former colleague who now worked in background investigations, I quietly looked into Richard and Melissa's financial situation. What I found explained everything. They were drowning in debt. Melissa had over $140,000 in student loans from an undergraduate degree followed by an MBA program she'd attended part-time at a private university. They'd bought a condo at the peak of the market and were underwater on the mortgage. They had 8 maxed-out credit cards totaling another $60,000 in debt. And Richard had made catastrophic investments in cryptocurrency. He'd put in $120,000, most of it borrowed, and lost nearly all of it when the market crashed. They needed money desperately, and I was the solution. I had equity in this house. It was worth approximately $900,000 now, purchased for $250,000 back in 2002. I had retirement accounts totaling $680,000. I had a monthly income of $4,200 from my pension and Social Security combined. I had collectibles, jewelry, art. I was, as they say, asset rich, and I was standing between them and financial salvation. The most painful part wasn't the money. I'd worked hard for what I had, yes, but money can be replaced. The painful part was understanding that my son, the boy I'd raised alone, sacrificed for, put through school, had looked at me and seen not a person, but an asset to be liquidated. He'd calculated my remaining lifespan and decided he couldn't wait for nature to take its course. He was trying to accelerate my irrelevance, to push me aside legally and financially while I was still alive and aware enough to feel the betrayal. So when Richard walked into my kitchen that Thursday afternoon with his folder full of forged documents and manufactured diagnoses, telling me I was dying soon and he'd already arranged to take my retirement income, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. Nothing really prepares you for hearing your own child speak about your death with anticipation rather than grief. Nothing prepares you for that particular kind of heartbreak. But heartbreak, I'd learned over 58 years of living, doesn't mean helplessness. Sometimes heartbreak is exactly the fuel you need to fight back. The morning after Richard's announcement about taking control of my finances, I was sitting in the fraud department at First National Bank by 9 a.m. The manager, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Diana Chen, spread the forged authorization forms across her desk and studied them with the intensity of someone who'd seen every scam in the book. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to tell you, this is one of the more sophisticated attempts we've seen. Whoever did this had access to your genuine signature from multiple sources. They studied your handwriting patterns. If our system hadn't flagged the slight variation in pressure points we use digital analysis now, this might have gone through." "It was my son," I said flatly. "Richard Morrison. He works for Deloitte in their consulting division, or at least he did last time I checked. He has copies of documents I've signed over the years. I've co-signed loans for him, given him powers of attorney for specific transactions when I was traveling abroad. He had plenty of source material. Diana's expression shifted from professional concern to something more personal. I'm so sorry. We see this more than you'd think. Family members are actually the most common perpetrators of elder financial abuse. I'm 58, I said. Hardly elderly. The law defines it as anyone over 55, and the tactics are the same regardless of age: undermining competence, isolating the victim, creating documentation to support legal action. She pulled out a form. I'm going to file an official fraud report. This will flag your son's name in our system. We'll also put additional security protocols on your accounts. No changes can be made without you appearing in person with 2 forms of ID, and we'll require a verbal password that only you know. I spent 2 hours at the bank, securing my accounts, reviewing every transaction from the past 6 months for anything suspicious, and setting up alerts for any attempted access. Diana also recommended I pull my credit reports to check for any accounts opened in my name. It turned out to be prescient advice. That afternoon, I discovered that someone had attempted to open 3 credit cards using my information. All had been declined because of credit freezes I'd had in place since a data breach at a medical provider 5 years ago, but the attempts had been made within the past month. The applications listed Richard's address as the mailing address for the cards. I sat in my home office, surrounded by printouts of attempted fraud, and felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. This wasn't desperation. This was systematic. Richard had been working on this for months, maybe longer, trying multiple angles to access my money. The bank account, the credit cards, the medical documentation of incompetence. It was a coordinated campaign. My phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. Hey, Mom, just checking in. I know yesterday was a lot to process, and I wanted to see how you're feeling about everything. Melissa and I are really just trying to help. We love you, and we want to make sure you're taken care of. Give me a call back when you get a chance. Oh, and we still need to schedule that appointment with our attorney about updating your will. It's important, Mom. Really important. Talk soon. The fake warmth in his voice made my skin crawl. I saved the voicemail, adding it to the documentation I was building. Over the next week, things escalated rapidly. Richard started calling daily, sometimes twice a day. When I didn't answer, he'd show up at my house unannounced. The first time, I didn't let him in. He stood on my porch for 20 minutes, knocking and calling through the door that he was worried about me, that my refusal to see him proved I wasn't thinking clearly. My neighbor, Patricia Hammond, came over after Richard finally left. Patricia was 72, a retired school teacher who'd lived next door for 15 years. She'd brought over a casserole and concern in equal measures. Eleanor, what's going on? Richard seemed very upset. He stopped me on my way to my car and said, you've been having some kind of episodes, that you're refusing medical help. And there it was. Richard was talking to my neighbors, planting his narrative. I invited Patricia inside and spent an hour telling her the truth. I showed her the bank documents, the forged signatures, the credit card applications. I explained what Richard was trying to do. Patricia's face went from confusion to shock to fury. That's appalling. Eleanor, you're one of the sharpest people I know. You help me with my taxes every year. You remember everyone's birthdays. You're reading 2 books at once and doing the Times crossword in pen. She shook her head. What do you need? What can I do to help? If Richard approaches you again with concerns about me, I need you to document exactly what he says and when. Would you be willing to write it down, date it, sign it? Absolutely. And Eleanor, I'm not the only one he's talked to. He spoke with the Matsudas across the street last week, and I saw him talking to Tom Gardner from the corner house. You should probably let people know what's really happening. I did exactly that. Over the next 2 days, I visited or called every neighbor on my street, explained the situation in clear terms, and asked them to document any conversations Richard had with them. Most were shocked. Several admitted he'd approached them with concerns about my declining condition. But now that they thought about it, they couldn't recall any actual incidents that suggested cognitive problems. Richard had been vague, using phrases like, "We're just worried," and "you know how it is with aging," without providing concrete examples, because there weren't any concrete examples to provide. Mrs. Matsuda, a tiny Japanese woman in her 80s who'd been a mathematics professor, was particularly incensed. Your son told me you'd forgotten to turn off your stove 3 times last month and nearly caused a fire. I almost called you to check on you. But you didn't have any fires, did you? Not a single one. My smoke detectors haven't gone off in 5 years, and that was because I burned toast. He's lying about you, to your own neighbors. What kind of son does that? The kind who's trying to build a case for incompetency, I thought, but didn't say. By the end of that week, I had signed statements from 7 neighbors attesting to my complete competence and detailing Richard's attempts to spread concerns about my mental state. I also had something else. Patricia had remembered that Richard had asked to use her phone during one of his visits because his battery was dead. She'd agreed, and he'd stepped into her kitchen to make a call. Patricia had Ring cameras. When we reviewed the footage, we could see Richard in her kitchen, not making a call, but taking photos of my house from her window, including shots that showed my car in the driveway at odd times, my blinds closed during the day, my walkway with leaves scattered on it. He was building a visual narrative of neglect and isolation. The following Monday, Richard showed up with Melissa and another person, a thin man in his 50s, wearing a cheap suit and carrying a briefcase. Richard knocked insistently until I finally opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "Mom, this is Kenneth Sutherland. He's an attorney who specializes in elder care planning. We really need to sit down and discuss your situation." "I don't need elder care planning. I'm not a client of Mr. Sutherland's, and I didn't invite him here." Kenneth Sutherland gave me a smile that probably worked on people who didn't know what an attorney's smile really meant. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand your son has some concerns about your well-being. I'm just here to explain some options that might make things easier for everyone. I'm also an attorney, Mr. Sutherland. I spent 40 years practicing corporate law. I know exactly what you're here to do, and it's not happening. Richard, you and your wife and your hired attorney need to leave my property right now. Mom, you're being paranoid and difficult. This is exactly the kind of behavior we've been documenting." Richard held up his phone, and I realized he was recording me. "You're refusing reasonable help, acting hostile toward people trying to assist you. I'm refusing to be manipulated. There's a significant difference." I kept my voice level, calm, because I knew he was recording, and I wasn't going to give him footage of an unstable, emotional woman. "You forged my signature on bank documents. You attempted to open credit cards in my name. You've been spreading lies about my mental state to my neighbors. I've documented all of it, and if you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the police." Melissa spoke for the first time, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Mrs. M, you're confused. Richard would never do those things. He loves you. We both love you. We're just worried because you're making accusations that don't make sense. Get off my porch." They left, but not before Richard shouted through the door that he'd be back with Adult Protective Services, that they'd see I was being neglected and confused, that he had documentation and witnesses and a responsibility to intervene. I called my attorney within 5 minutes of their departure. Catherine Ross had been a colleague of mine when we were both junior associates, and now she ran her own practice specializing in estate planning and elder law. I'd helped her win a difficult case 10 years ago, and she owed me a favor. More importantly, she was brilliant and tenacious. "Ellie, what you're describing is textbook financial exploitation with attempted conservatorship. Your son is trying to have you declared incompetent so he can take control of your assets." Catherine's voice was grim. "The good news is you're way ahead of this. Most victims don't see it coming until it's too late. The bad news is that once this kind of campaign starts, it can be hard to stop completely. He'll keep trying different angles. What do? We go on offense. We document everything, which you're already doing. We get you a comprehensive medical and psychiatric evaluation from reputable independent doctors. And I mean comprehensive, the kind that costs $5,000 and takes 6 hours. So we have irrefutable proof of your competence. We send Richard a cease and desist letter. We file for a restraining order if he doesn't back off. And we make it crystal clear that if he continues, you'll press criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse. He's my son, Catherine. He's stealing from you, Ellie. He's trying to legally erase your autonomy. That's not acting like a son. That's acting like a criminal who happens to share your DNA." She was right, and we both knew it. We scheduled a meeting for the next day to start building my case. That night, around 10 p.m., and I heard someone at my back door. I'd installed a security system 2 days earlier. Not a full system, Just cameras at the front and back doors with motion detection. My phone buzzed with an alert, and I pulled up the camera feed to see Richard trying to slide something into the door frame near the lock. He was trying to jimmy the door open. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, watching on the camera as Richard worked at the lock. The operator answered, and I said clearly, "There's someone trying to break into my house through the back door. I can see him on my security camera. Please send officers immediately." I gave my address and stayed on the line. Richard must have heard something or given up because he suddenly disappeared from the camera's view. By the time the police arrived 8 minutes later, he was gone. But the camera had captured everything in clear, time-stamped video. My own son attempting to break into my house at night. The officers took my statement and copies of the video footage. They also took note when I explained the broader context, the financial exploitation attempt, the forged documents, the campaign to have me declared incompetent. One of the officers, a woman in her 30s named Officer Ramirez, handed me her card. "Ma'am, you need to file a full report and press charges. What you're describing is elder abuse, and it's a felony in Oregon. The attempted break-in gives us probable cause. We can pick him up for questioning. He's my son. I understand. But he's also committing crimes against you, serious crimes. And in my experience, this kind of behavior escalates. It doesn't get better on its own." After the officers left, I sat in my living room and thought about that word, escalates. Richard had gone from manipulation to forgery to attempted breaking and entering in a matter of weeks. What would he try next? How desperate was he? How far would he go? I pulled out my laptop and spent the next hour researching. I found news stories about adult children who'd killed their parents for inheritance money. I found cases where people had been forcibly committed to psychiatric facilities by family members seeking control of their assets. I found articles about conservatorship abuse, about families torn apart by greed, about elderly people who'd spent their final years fighting their own children in court. This was my life now. This was what my relationship with my only child had become. Around midnight, I went to my refrigerator and opened the vegetable drawer. The plastic container was exactly where I'd left it, but when I opened it, I could tell someone had been through it. The papers weren't in quite the same order. The envelope I'd placed on top was now second from the top. Richard had been in my house. He'd gotten in somehow. Maybe he had a copy of my key from years ago. Maybe he'd jimmied a different lock successfully, and he'd found exactly what I'd expected him to find. The question was whether what he'd found would be enough to stop him, or whether it would just make him more desperate. I pulled out the envelope and opened it, reviewing what I'd left for him to discover. It was a letter from Catherine Ross's office, dated and notarized, confirming that I'd updated my estate plan. The details were clear. 60% of my assets would go to a charitable trust supporting organizations that help victims of elder abuse. 30% would go to a foundation supporting women in law. 10% would go into a conditional trust for Richard, accessible only if he met specific requirements, including 5 years of demonstrated financial stability and ethical behavior, as determined by an independent review board. Attached to the letter was my most recent medical evaluation from my personal physician, Dr. Amanda Morrison, no relation, including cognitive testing that showed I was functioning at the level of someone 20 years younger. There were neurological assessments, psychiatric evaluations, memory tests, all of them pristine. And finally, there was a single-page summary of documented incidents of attempted financial exploitation, with a note that a full dossier had been filed with my attorney and with law enforcement. I'd left Richard a message. "I know what you're doing. I've protected myself. And if you continue, you'll lose everything." The question now was whether he'd be smart enough to back off or foolish enough to push forward. Based on the attempted break-in, I was betting on foolish. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Richard, sent at 12:47 a.m. "We need to talk, tomorrow. This is getting out of hand. I can explain everything." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my response. "Through attorneys only from this point forward. Do not contact me directly again." His reply came instantly. "Mom, please, you don't understand what's happening. Melissa and I are trying to protect you from something. There's information you don't have. Meet me for coffee tomorrow morning, 1 hour. Just listen, please." I almost deleted it. Almost. But something about the tone caught my attention. There's information you don't have. What information? Was this another manipulation? Or was there actually something else going on? Against my better judgment, I typed 10 a.m. Coffee shop on Morrison Street, public place, 1 hour. Thank you. Mom, I promise you'll understand everything tomorrow. I set my phone down and wondered if I'd just made a terrible mistake. But I needed to know what Richard thought he could possibly say that would explain attempted forgery, identity theft, and breaking and entering. I needed to hear what excuse he'd manufactured, what story he'd constructed to justify the unjustifiable. And more than that, I needed to look my son in the eyes one more time and know for certain whether there was anything left of the boy I'd raised or whether that person was completely gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could see anyone approaching. I'd told Catherine about this meeting, and she'd advised against it, but I'd insisted. She'd made me promise to record the conversation. Oregon is a one-party consent state, meaning I only needed my own permission, and to leave immediately if I felt threatened. My phone was in my jacket pocket, recording app already running. Richard arrived exactly at 10, looking like he hadn't slept. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes, usually impeccable, looked wrinkled. He ordered coffee at the counter, then sat down across from me with the careful movements of someone approaching a wild animal. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly. "You have 1 hour. Talk." He took a breath, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to, and said words I never expected to hear. "Mom, Melissa is dying. She has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She has maybe 6 months, probably less. And she's drowning me in medical debt that's going to destroy both of us unless I can find a way to pay for treatment that insurance won't cover." I felt like I'd been slapped. Whatever I'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. "What?" "She was diagnosed 4 months ago. The cancer is aggressive, already metastasized. There's an experimental treatment at a clinic in Germany that's shown promise, but it costs $350,000, and insurance considers it investigational, so they won't cover a penny." His voice cracked. "I've borrowed everything I can. I've maxed out every credit card, taken out loans, sold everything we have that's worth anything. I'm still $200,000 short, and every day I can't get her, that treatment is a day closer to losing her." I stared at my son, trying to process what he was telling me. "If this is true, why didn't you just ask me for help? Why the forgery, the lies, the attempts to have me declared incompetent? Because you wouldn't have given it to me." His eyes met mine, and there was real pain there. "Not for Melissa. You never liked her. You thought she was using me, and you were right. She married me thinking I came from money because of your career in this house. But then she fell in love with me anyway, and now she's dying, and I can't save her by asking nicely for money you'd never give. So you decided to steal it instead. To destroy my reputation, forge my signature, tell my neighbors I was losing my mind. I was desperate, Mom. I am desperate. Do you know what it's like watching someone you love die and knowing you could save them if you just had enough money? Every ethical line starts to look pretty blurry when it's your wife's life on the other side." He pulled out his phone and showed me photos, medical records with Melissa's name and adenocarcinoma, stage 4, in stark black text, prescription bottles, a treatment proposal from the Heidelberg Medical Institute outlining the experimental protocol and the cost breakdown. Photos of Melissa in a hospital bed, looking thin and pale, completely different from the polished woman who'd walked through my house photographing my possessions. The stuff with your retirement, the bank accounts, I thought if I could just get access to your monthly income for a year, maybe 18 months, I could funnel it directly to the treatment center. You'd never even have to know. You have plenty in your investment accounts. You wouldn't miss it. And when I did notice, when I realized my retirement was being stolen, I'd planned to tell you it was a banking error, help you get it back, make it look like I'd saved you from fraud. I had the whole thing worked out." He laughed bitterly. "Obviously, I underestimated you. I forgot who my mother was, the woman who won impossible cases for 40 years, the woman who raised me alone and never let anything stop her." I sat there, trying to untangle truth from manipulation. Because even if Melissa really was sick, even if Richard really was desperate, that didn't justify what he'd done. Understandable, wasn't the same as acceptable. "Show me proof," I said. "Real proof. I want to talk to her doctors. I want to see the actual medical records, not photos that could be doctored. I want the treatment center's information so I can verify they exist and the program is real." Richard nodded, pulling out a folder I hadn't noticed he'd brought. "I thought you might. It's all here. Her oncologist is Dr. James Chen at Oregon Health Sciences. The treatment center is real. You can call them yourself. Everything is documented." I took the folder and flipped through it. Hospital admission records, pathology reports, CT scans with radiologist notes describing tumors in the pancreas and liver, letters from insurance denying coverage, an invoice from Heidelberg Medical Institute with payment terms. It looked real. All of it looked devastatingly real. "If Melissa is dying," I said slowly, "why was she walking through my house taking photos of my valuables? Why was she talking about redesigning my living room? That doesn't sound like someone who's sick." "Because she doesn't know she's dying." Richard's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "She thinks the chemo is working. She thinks we're managing it with conventional treatment. I haven't told her how bad it really is because I didn't want her to give up hope while I was still trying to get the money together for Germany. And the photos, the comments about your house, that was before the diagnosis. She really did want your stuff, wanted to push you into downsizing so we could benefit. She's not a saint, Mom. She's human, and we were in financial trouble even before the cancer. But that doesn't mean she deserves to die." I looked at my son across the coffee shop table, and I felt something inside me shift. Because if this was true, if Melissa really was dying, and Richard really was trying to save her through increasingly desperate means, then I wasn't looking at a simple villain. I was looking at a man in an impossible situation making terrible choices. But I was also looking at a man who'd been willing to destroy his own mother to save his wife, who'd forged documents, spread lies, attempted to break into my house. The love that motivated him didn't erase the damage he'd caused. "I need time," I said. "I need to verify everything, talk to the doctors, confirm this is real and not another layer of manipulation. We don't have time. The clinic needs a deposit of $100,000 by the end of this week, or they'll give Melissa's slot to someone else. There's a waiting list. If we lose this spot, that's it. She dies." "Richard, you're asking me to hand over $100,000 based on a folder of documents I haven't verified and a story that conveniently explains all your criminal behavior. You have to understand why I can't do that immediately. She'll be dead before you finish your due diligence." He was starting to raise his voice, and other customers were looking over. "Mom, please, I'm begging you. I'll sign anything. I'll give you control of the money, let you pay the clinic directly. I'll accept any conditions you want. Just please, help me save my wife." I looked at the desperation in his eyes, and I realized this was the moment. This was the point where I had to decide who I was going to be. A mother who helps her child no matter what, or a woman who protects herself even at the cost of potentially letting someone die. "Give me 48 hours, I finally said. "I'll verify everything. If it's true, we'll talk about how I can help." "But Richard, if any of this is a lie, if this is just another manipulation, I will make sure you face every legal consequence available. Do you understand me? It's true, all of it. Thank you, Mom. Thank you." He reached across the table like he was going to take my hand, but I pulled back. Because even if his story was true, even if his motivations were born from love rather than greed, he'd still done unforgivable things, and I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I left the coffee shop with Richard's folder clutched in my hands and went straight to Catherine's office. She cleared her afternoon schedule, and we spent 3 hours on the phone with doctors, medical facilities, and the treatment center in Germany. By 5 p.m., we had answers, and they weren't what I expected. Melissa did have pancreatic cancer. That part was true. Dr. James Chen at OHSU confirmed it, though he was careful about patient privacy until I explained I was potentially financing treatment and had Melissa's signed HIPAA release from the folder Richard had provided. The diagnosis was real. Stage 4, poor prognosis, but the experimental treatment in Germany was where the story fell apart. Mrs. Morrison, the administrator at Heidelberg Medical Institute, said, in accented but perfect English, "We did provide that treatment proposal to Mr. Morrison 3 months ago. However, I must tell you that we've since informed him the treatment is not appropriate for his wife's case. Her cancer has progressed too far. The protocol only works in patients where metastasis is limited to 1 or 2 sites. Mrs. Morrison's cancer is now in her liver, lungs, and bones. The treatment would not save her. It might extend her life by weeks, perhaps 2 months at most, while significantly reducing her quality of life. I felt cold. You told Richard this? Yes, 6 weeks ago. We recommended he focus on palliative care and making his wife comfortable. We even refunded the initial consultation fee he'd paid. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but Mr. Morrison's request for treatment at this stage would be, frankly, a waste of resources that could help someone with a better chance of survival. After I hung up, Catherine and I sat in silence for a long moment. So Melissa is dying, but Richard knows the German treatment won't save her, which means, Catherine started, which means he's still lying. He's using his wife's real illness as cover for stealing money he knows won't actually help her. I felt sick. He's exploiting her cancer to manipulate me. The question is, what's he really planning to do with the money? We found out that evening. I'd asked my investigator friend to dig deeper into Richard and Melissa's finances, and she called me at 7 p.m. with information that made everything suddenly, horribly clear. Richard and Melissa owed money to people who weren't banks. They'd borrowed $80,000 from a private lender, essentially a loan shark operating just barely within legal boundaries, at a 23% interest rate. The loan had been for Richard's cryptocurrency investments, the ones that had failed spectacularly. They were 4 months behind on payments, and according to court records my investigator had found, the lender had filed a lawsuit. If Richard didn't pay the outstanding balance of $92,000 by the end of the month, the lender would get a judgment that could garnish his wages, seize his assets, and potentially force him into bankruptcy. Bankruptcy that would become infinitely more complicated and expensive if Melissa died and her medical debts became part of the equation. Richard didn't need money to save Melissa. He needed money to save himself from the consequences of his own disastrous financial decisions. Melissa's cancer was real, but Richard was using it as a shield, as justification, as the tragic backstory that would make me open my wallet out of sympathy. That son of a bitch, I said quietly, and Catherine didn't disagree. What do you want to do? I want to confront him, but not alone. I want him to confess to everything, and I want it documented so thoroughly that he can never twist the narrative again. We set the trap for the next evening. I texted Richard that I'd verified his story and was willing to help, but I needed to discuss the terms in person. I suggested he come to my house at 7 p.m. What I didn't tell him was that Catherine would be there, along with a court reporter she'd hired, and that every word would be recorded both on video and in a legal transcript. Richard arrived right on time, and I could see the relief on his face when I opened the door. That relief died when he saw Catherine sitting at my dining room table with the court reporter and her stenography machine. "Mom, what is this?" "This is you telling the truth for once. Sit down, Richard. I'm not saying anything with lawyers and court reporters here. This is supposed to be a private conversation between family. You lost the right to privacy when you forged my signature and tried to steal my retirement. Sit down, or this meeting is over, and you get nothing except the police report I'll file within the hour." He sat. His jaw was clenched, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what I knew and what I didn't. Catherine opened a folder. "Mr. Morrison, let's start with the Heidelberg Medical Institute. When did they inform you that your wife was no longer a candidate for their treatment protocol?" That's not. We spoke with them this afternoon. They told us they notified you 6 weeks ago that the treatment wouldn't work for your wife's condition. They refunded your consultation fee. So when you told your mother yesterday that this treatment could save Melissa, you were lying, weren't you? Richard's face had gone pale. "They're wrong. I've been reading studies. There are cases where it worked even in advanced stages. That's not what their lead researcher told us. He was very clear. The treatment would be futile and cruel at this stage of your wife's illness." Catherine pulled out another document. "Let's talk about Marcus Lending Group. You borrowed $80,000 from them 14 months ago. You're currently in default, and they have a court date scheduled for next week. That's what you really need money for, isn't it? Not treatment for Melissa. Your own debts." How did you? Richard looked at me, and there was anger in his eyes now, not remorse. You investigated me? Your own son? What kind of mother does that? The kind whose son tried to rob her. My voice was steady, cold. The kind who spent 40 years learning that people lie, especially when they're desperate. You used your wife's cancer as an excuse to steal from me, Richard. You manufactured a story about saving her life when you knew the treatment wouldn't work. You were going to let me believe I was helping Melissa when really I'd be bailing you out of debts you accumulated through your own reckless gambling. It wasn't gambling, it was investing. In cryptocurrency you didn't understand. With borrowed money you couldn't afford to lose. That's gambling. I leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to answer every question Catherine asks you. You're going to tell the complete truth about everything. The forged bank documents, the credit card applications, the fake medical reports about my incompetence, the loan sharks, all of it. And if you do that, if you're honest for once in this entire nightmare, I'll make you an offer. What kind of offer? Answer the questions first. For the next 90 minutes, Catherine took Richard through everything. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word. Richard tried to deflect, to minimize, to justify. But Catherine was relentless. She'd been a prosecutor before going into private practice, and she knew how to dismantle someone's story brick by brick. Yes, he'd forged my signature on the bank authorization. Yes, he'd tried to open credit cards in my name. Yes, he'd lied to my neighbors about my mental state. Yes, he'd created false medical records. He'd actually paid someone $2,000 to produce the fake letter from Dr. Patterson. Yes, he'd known for 6 weeks that the German treatment wouldn't save Melissa. Yes, he'd planned to use my money to pay off his loan shark debts. Yes, he'd attempted to break into my house when he realized I was protecting myself. By the time Catherine finished, Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years. He slumped in his chair, defeated, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Are you going to press charges? That depends on what you do next. I pulled out a document I'd prepared. This is a confession of everything you just admitted to. You're going to sign it. You're also going to sign an agreement that you'll never again attempt to access my finances, contact my bank, or make any claims about my mental competence. You'll stay at least 500 feet away from my home unless I explicitly invite you. You'll enter credit counseling and debt management programs. And you'll tell Melissa the truth about her prognosis and stop giving her false hope about treatments that won't work. If I sign this, will you help us with the debts? I'll pay off the Marcus Lending Group loan. I'll do it directly, not through you. That's $92,000 that will keep you out of bankruptcy and keep those particular sharks away from you. I'll also pay for Melissa's hospice care when the time comes so she can be comfortable and you won't be destroyed by end-of-life medical bills. But that's all. No money for you personally. No additional bailouts. You created this mess with your choices, and you'll have to work your way out of the rest of it. Why would you do even that much after everything I've done? I looked at my son, and I felt an exhaustion so deep, it went all the way to my bones. Because despite everything, you're still my child. And because Melissa doesn't deserve to suffer because of your mistakes. But make no mistake, Richard, this is the last time. If you ever try anything like this again, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law, and you will go to prison. Do you understand me? Yes. He was crying now, tears running down his face. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to me. The debts kept piling up, and Melissa got sick, and I couldn't see any other way out. There were 1,000 other ways out. You could have declared bankruptcy. You could have asked me for help honestly. You could have sold your condo, downsized your lifestyle, worked extra jobs. But instead, you chose to victimize your own mother. That's not desperation, Richard. That's a fundamental failure of character. He signed the documents with shaking hands. Catherine and the court reporter witnessed the signatures. And just like that, it was done. Richard had confessed to everything, agreed to stay away from me, and accepted the limited help I was willing to provide. One more thing, I said, as he was preparing to leave. I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this out of forgiveness. I don't forgive you. Maybe someday I will, but not today, not next month, maybe not ever. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Helping with Melissa's care is right. Keeping you from being destroyed by loan sharks is right, even if you don't deserve it. But we're not going back to normal. We're not going to have Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations and pretend this never happened. You destroyed something between us, and I don't know if it can ever be repaired." Richard nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you do. I think you still see this as a situation you can eventually smooth over, a mistake you can apologize your way out of. But it's not. You looked at me and saw an obstacle to overcome, a resource to extract. You calculated my remaining lifespan and decided it was too long to wait. That's not something I can forget, Richard. That's not something a mother should ever have to know about her child. I never meant—" "Yes, you did. You meant every bit of it. You planned it, executed it, and only stopped because I caught you. Don't insult me further by claiming otherwise." He left my house at 9:30 that night, and I watched through the window as he sat in his car for 10 minutes before finally driving away. Catherine and the court reporter packed up their equipment, and Catherine squeezed my shoulder as she left. "You did the right thing, Ellie. Holding him accountable while still maintaining your humanity. That's not easy." After everyone was gone, I sat alone in my living room and let myself cry for the first time since this nightmare began. I cried for the son I'd thought I had, the one who apparently had never really existed. I cried for the years I'd spent sacrificing for his future, never imagining he'd grow into someone who'd try to rob me. I cried for Melissa, dying of cancer, and married to a man who'd lie to her about her chances while using her illness to manipulate others. But mostly, I cried for myself, for the loss of the one relationship I'd thought was unbreakable, for the loneliness of realizing I couldn't trust my own child, for the knowledge that I'd spend whatever years I had left knowing my son had wished them away. Around midnight, I dried my eyes, poured myself a glass of wine, and made a decision. I would survive this. I would protect myself. I would live whatever life I had left on my own terms, with clear eyes about who people really were rather than who I wished them to be. And if that meant being alone, well, I'd been alone before. I'd raised Richard alone, built my career alone, navigated loss and grief alone. I knew how to survive solitude. What I wouldn't survive was living in denial, pretending everything was fine when my own son had proven he couldn't be trusted. The cold open, the moment Richard had announced he was taking my retirement because I'd die soon, that had been the beginning of this nightmare. But this moment, sitting in my living room with signed confessions and legal protections in place, this was the end of my innocence about family. And somehow, painful as it was, it felt like a kind of freedom. 3 months after that night in my living room, I stood at the window of my home office, watching the early morning rain wash down the street. Portland in November is gray and constant, but I'd always found something comforting in it. The predictability of the weather, the way the rain cleaned everything, made it new. I'd kept my word. I paid off Richard's debt to Marcus Lending Group, handling it through Catherine so I never had to interact with those people directly. $92,000 that saved my son from bankruptcy, and possibly worse. I also set up an account for Melissa's hospice care, though she wasn't there yet. According to the brief updates Richard sent via email, our only form of communication now, she was still fighting, still believing the conventional chemotherapy might work. He hadn't told her the truth about her prognosis. I didn't know if that made him merciful or cowardly. Maybe both. Richard had honored the agreement. He stayed away from my house, didn't contact my bank, didn't approach my neighbors. He'd enrolled in the debt counseling program I'd required, and according to the reports I received, he was actually following through. He and Melissa had sold their condo and moved to a modest 2-bedroom apartment. He'd taken a second job doing freelance consulting on weekends. He was, by all appearances, trying to dig himself out of the hole he'd created. But we weren't reconciled. We weren't a family again. We were 2 people connected by biology and history who'd learned to coexist at a safe distance. Patricia came over most Tuesday evenings now. We'd drink tea and play Scrabble and talk about everything except Richard. She'd become more than a neighbor. She was a friend, maybe the closest friend I had. She understood what it meant to be disappointed by family. Her own daughter lived in Boston and called maybe twice a year. We were 2 women who'd learned that chosen family sometimes matters more than blood. I'd also started volunteering at the Oregon Elder Rights Coalition, an organization that helps seniors facing financial exploitation. 2 afternoons a week, I'd sit in their offices downtown and talk to people whose children, grandchildren, or supposed caregivers were stealing from them. I helped them understand their legal options, connected them with attorneys, walked them through the process of protecting themselves. My own experience made me credible in a way that legal expertise alone never could. Mrs. Morrison, one woman in her 70s, had said just last week, tears streaming down her face, "You don't know what it means to talk to someone who understands. Everyone keeps saying, 'But she's your daughter,' like that should make me accept being robbed. Being family doesn't give someone the right to victimize you," I told her. "Love isn't permission to abuse. You have the right to protect yourself, even from your own children." I believed it when I said it to her. I was still working on believing it about myself. My own estate planning was now ironclad. Catherine had helped me create a structure that protected my assets from any future exploitation attempts. 60% to the charitable trusts I'd mentioned in that letter Richard found in my refrigerator, organizations fighting elder abuse and supporting women in law. 30% to a foundation I'd established that would provide scholarships for single mothers pursuing legal careers. 10% in a conditional trust for Richard, accessible only if he met strict requirements over 5 years, financial stability, verified ethical behavior, completion of therapy, and a clean legal record. An independent board would make the determination. He'd have to earn it, and even then, it would be a fraction of what he might have received if he'd just been patient and decent. I'd also updated my medical directives and powers of attorney. If something happened to me, Richard would have no say in my care. Catherine was my healthcare proxy. Patricia was backup. I'd named a professional fiduciary service as my financial power of attorney if I ever became incapacitated. Richard couldn't touch me, couldn't control me, couldn't override my wishes no matter what happened. It hurt to do it. Every signature on those documents felt like acknowledging a failure. My failure as a mother to raise a son who could be trusted. His failure as a son to be trustworthy. But it was necessary. I'd learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. The doorbell rang around 10 a.m., pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I felt that old spike of anxiety. Was it Richard, violating the agreement? I checked the Ring camera on my phone and saw a woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch, holding a bundle of flowers. I opened the door cautiously, keeping it chained. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Melissa, Richard's wife." She looked nothing like the polished woman I remembered from months ago. She was thin, wearing a knit cap that probably covered hair loss from chemotherapy, her face pale and tired, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. Richard doesn't know I came. I looked up your address in his old phone records. I needed to talk to you." I hesitated, then unlatched the chain and let her in. She walked slowly, carefully, like someone whose body hurt. I led her to the living room, and we sat on opposite ends of my couch. "Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you. I can't stay long. Richard thinks I'm at a doctor's appointment." She took a breath. "I know what he did. I know all of it. He finally told me the truth 2 weeks ago, about the debts, about the loan sharks, about trying to steal from you, about lying to me about my chances with the German treatment. I'm sorry you're going through this. All of it. I'm dying, Mrs. Morrison. We both know that. I've known it for a while, actually, even though Richard kept trying to protect me from it. You can feel it when your own body is giving up." She pulled an envelope from her purse. "I wrote you a letter. I wanted to apologize for my part in what happened. I was the one who encouraged Richard to ask you for money. I was the one who suggested taking photos of your things, who said maybe we could convince you to downsize. I didn't know he'd go as far as he did. The forgery, the fake medical reports, all of that was him. But I planted the seeds, and I'm sorry. I took the envelope but didn't open it. You were scared. You were sick. I understand why you'd look for financial help anywhere you could find it. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make what Richard did forgivable. But I wanted you to know that he's genuinely trying to change. The debt counseling, the second job, selling the condo, he's not doing it because he has to. He's doing it because he finally understands what he almost destroyed." She paused. "He talks about you sometimes. He'll see something that reminds him of when he was a kid, or he'll remember something you taught him, and he'll just sit there with this look on his face like he's trying to figure out where he went wrong. Melissa, why are you telling me this? Because when I'm gone, he'll be alone. His mother won't speak to him. He doesn't really have friends. He burned those bridges with his financial disasters, and I don't want him to be completely alone when I die. I'm not asking you to forgive him or trust him or even see him. I'm just asking you to remember that somewhere inside the man who did those terrible things is still the boy you raised, and maybe someday, if he proves he's changed, you could leave a door open, even just a crack. I looked at this dying woman sitting in my living room, using some of her limited energy to advocate for my son, and I felt something shift in my chest. I can't make any promises. I know, I'm not asking for promises, just don't completely close yourself off to the possibility. That's all. She stood slowly, and I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. Thank you for paying for the hospice care. Richard told me. I know I don't deserve your generosity after everything, but I'm grateful for it. You're not responsible for Richard's choices. You're just dealing with the consequences of them, like I am. After she left, I sat with her letter for a long time before opening it. It was handwritten, 3 pages of neat script that probably took her significant effort given how weak she must be. She wrote about meeting Richard, about the early days of their marriage when they'd been happy and hopeful. She wrote about her regrets, pushing for things they couldn't afford, encouraging him to take financial risks, caring too much about appearances and material things. She wrote about how cancer had clarified what mattered and how she wished she'd learned those lessons earlier, before the debt and desperation had corrupted Richard's judgment. The last paragraph stayed with me. I used to think love meant never having boundaries, never saying no, always being available. But I've learned that real love includes accountability. You held Richard accountable, and that was the most loving thing you could have done, even though it didn't feel like it. You showed him that actions have consequences, even with family, especially with family. I hope he becomes worthy of a second chance with you someday. But if he doesn't, if he never earns back your trust, please know that you tried. You gave him everything he needed to succeed. What he did with those gifts was his choice, not your failure. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of my desk, where I kept important things. Melissa was right about some things and wrong about others, but her perspective mattered. She was dying, and she'd used her time to try to bridge a gap she hadn't created. There was something noble in that, even if it didn't change my relationship with Richard. That evening, I sent Richard an email. Brief, not warm, but honest. Melissa visited me today. She didn't need to do that, but I'm glad she did. I can't promise reconciliation or even regular contact, but I acknowledge that you're making efforts to change, and I respect that. When Melissa passes, if you need help with funeral arrangements, you can contact me through Catherine. I won't abandon you to handle that alone. That's all I can offer right now. He responded within an hour. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. He was right. It was more than he deserved, but it was what I could live with. A careful balance between protecting myself and maintaining my humanity. I'd learned that I could hold boundaries and still have compassion. I could refuse to be victimized while acknowledging that people are complicated, that desperation makes monsters of decent people sometimes, that my son was both the man who'd tried to rob me and the boy who'd once brought me dandelions from the yard and called them flowers. I was 58 years old. If statistics held, I had another 25 or 30 years ahead of me. I'd spend them on my own terms, with my eyes wide open, surrounded by people who'd earned my trust rather than assume they deserved it by virtue of shared DNA. I'd volunteer for elder rights, mentor young women attorneys, travel to places I'd always wanted to see, read all the books stacked on my nightstand, cultivate friendships with people like Patricia who understood that family is what you build, not just what you're born into. And maybe, if Richard truly changed, if years of consistent ethical behavior proved Melissa's faith in his potential wasn't misplaced, maybe there could be something between us again someday. Not what we'd had before. That was gone. Destroyed the moment he told me I'd die soon so he could take my retirement. But perhaps something new. Something built on reality rather than assumptions, on earned trust rather than obligatory love. Or maybe not. Maybe we'd spend the rest of our lives as estranged as we were now, connected only by monthly emails and the knowledge that we'd once meant everything to each other. Either way, I'd be fine. I'd survived my husband's death, single motherhood, 40 years in a demanding career, and my son's betrayal. I'd protected myself when I needed protection and extended mercy when I could afford it. I'd learned that being strong doesn't mean being hard, and that protecting yourself doesn't require closing yourself off completely. I stood at my window watching the rain and thought about that moment in my kitchen when Richard had spread his forged documents across my counter. I'd felt broken then, betrayed beyond repair. But I wasn't broken. I was changed, certainly. More cautious, more guarded, less naive about the nature of family bonds. But I was also stronger, clearer about my values, more certain about my right to protect myself even from people I loved. The rain kept falling, washing Portland clean, and I turned away from the window to start my day. There was work to do at the Elder Rights Coalition, dinner plans with Patricia, a book I was in the middle of that I wanted to finish. My life was full and purposeful, built on foundations I'd created myself rather than ones that could be stolen or destroyed by someone else's choices. I'd learned the hardest lesson a mother can learn, that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to them, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to family is no, not yet. Not unless you change, not on these terms. And I'd learned to live with that, to be at peace with it, to know that I'd done what was right even though it was painful, and that my future was mine to control, mine to protect, mine to live. That was enough. It had to be enough. And surprisingly, impossibly, it was.